We do have a room full of and an audience full of grant makers and the people who love them, nonprofits. So I want to ask a question that gets particularly to this notion of what can philanthropy do to restore civility. Okay, somebody comes to you, you're a grant maker, somebody comes to you, they have a great idea, they read, the Fixes column, and they want to do a local application of this great program that's going to decrease bullying, restore civility, bring peace and harmony to the political sphere, you name it. The question the funder has to ask is, how will I know whether my money was well spent? The nature of philanthropy right now is measurable outcomes and impacts. With a topic as elusive as civility, how do you measure impact?
Well, so if you look at, just to take a very specific example, if you look at a school environment or a play environment or a sports environment, there's lots of social science about measuring the quality of relationships, the number of relationships. So there is quite a whole, I was at a conference where there were 50 researchers in a room all debating the best ways to measure empathy and civility in schools. So there's a whole discipline about that. There's what the Interfaith Youth Corps is doing on campuses is they have specific specific surveys that have been designed by evaluation firms to look at the kinds of things that the social science says are very strong proxies for civility, like appreciative knowledge, willingness to have relationships with the number of relationships you have with the different types of relationships. Those things tend to correlate quite well. One of the things that Robert Putnam shows clearly is that diversity left alone produces fragmentation. It doesn't lead to tolerance. Diversity in and of itself will lead to less altruism, less trust, less cooperation, unless you actually make a concerted effort to build cross-cutting bridges. So now that we live in this society that's becoming more diverse, every developed country is becoming way more diverse. As 25 years from now, it'll just be more. We have to say, well, from the philanthropy point of view, we need to have programs that can consciously build cross-cutting leaders on campuses, in civic associations, at the level of the municipality, at the level of, it's harder to do in companies because there's lots of things that you can't really talk about in a business environment, but certainly there's enough public places where you actually nurture people who know how to construct the kind of conversation that leads to not people abrasively attacking one another, but actually leads to these things, appreciative knowledge and a willingness to have more relationships. It's not easy, but it's not like rocket science either. It's doable, and it's been replicated in many places, and we could produce more.
I completely agree with this, and I think there are lots of measures now that we can use. One thing that social science has produced over the last 50 years is a detailed understanding of the tools that you can bring to bear, the formal tools that you can bring to bear to evaluate attitudes and the success of various kinds of social endeavors. But the big question, of course, the thing that has us all exercise in the first place, which is how to make our society, our democracy work better. The point of producing all these other things that we're trying to measure is that we hope that if we get all those other things improved, this big thing will improve. Well, I think that we'll see. You don't need measures. If we actually over the next decade can produce, and I think timescale is important here. Of course, one's very impatient, and one would like these things to be solved now. I'd like proper health care to survive. Right, I'd like it to be done next week, or rather, not undone next week. But in the long run, what really works, the big revolutions happen. They take a generation. They have to be done patiently and slowly. We can measure increases in empathy and so on, and they're worth measuring and so on. But in the end, the real test is going to be, if we put our resources into doing these things, if we develop our society in these ways, will it be the case 20 years from now that we have a society which knows how to govern itself in a more effective way? I don't think anybody, wherever you are on the political spectrum, you can't be happy with the ways in which we're failing to face up to all kinds of problems. Again, we may disagree about what the solutions are, but most people can see that we're not doing very well with health, environment, economy, foreign policy, the management of global nuclear. I mean, there's just a whole list of things where we need to do something, we can't do something, and the real test in the long run is going to be if over 10, 15, 20 years we can produce a society that's more effective at handling those things.
Okay, last question for me, then we'll go to your questions. You're going to go back home tomorrow. Let's assume you're home in Scarsdale, Pittsburgh, or Pennington, and the phone rings.
Manhattan. It was in Scarsdale.
Oh, you're in Scarsdale. Okay.
It wouldn't have happened in Manhattan.
All right, bad guess on my part. You know what happens when you assume. Phone rings, and it's President Obama on the phone, and he is calling to ask you, he's appointing you America's new czar of civility. And roll the ironies of that around in your mind, the czar of civility. So you're going to start work next week. You got 1 week to figure out what would be your first action or your first deed in office to set the tone and expectations for the new czar of civility for the United States of America. David, you have a light shining in your eyes. You have an idea.
I always feel like social change happens through, primarily through bright spots. People become aware of possibilities. They see things that are happening that they didn't know were happening, and they're like, oh my goodness, you can do that? So I would immediately say, what are the 50 best examples across the United States of places where people are doing this stuff, it's working, it's happening in different kinds of communities, different kinds of settings, and I would shine a spotlight on them, kind of like my State of the Union address, and the person gets up, just like so-and-so sitting next to Michelle Obama. You give people examples. People, I think we learn primarily through stories and examples, so I would tell lots of stories of the people renewing American civility. This is what they look like. They look just like you. Some of them are 70-year-old lawyers. Some of them are 8-year-old kids. And look at this. Look what we have to work with. We have extraordinary resources. Why are we listening to talk radio? Why are we paying attention to the crazy people who are doing intolerant things and letting them infect our minds when we have all of these stories?
Kathy, might you be willing to lead the United States Congress in a play workshop?
Oh, that I would do. I would do that. But if I got the call from President Obama, I think I would say thank you, but no. Call David. I like your answer.
I'm a Canadian, by the way, but I'm going to be naturalized, so if you have any contacts.
Oh, so that's why you have that penchant for nice. You're a Canadian.
Oh.
You're an interloper. Anthony?
My answer is the same, actually, which is that, I mean, both, I agree with both. That is, he'd be terrific, and he's right, that focusing on what's working. And the fact is, lots of stuff is working. So it's not as if, just back to my earlier point about the importance of holding on to the good things. I mean, there are lots of good things going on, and we're learning all the time. The social science is improving. About things we can do, and I think just pointing to things that have worked is a great way of getting people to think about how they can help.
Can you imagine if all the money in the super PACs were put into promoting the civility that's being done in the world in our country today?
Yes, we could look like Canada.
Bornstein with a budget. It's a great idea.